The most important thing you'll have to ask yourself before you start doing anything is, why do I want to do this? With a subject like law, it's a question you'll get asked all the time. Schools ask it if you're choosing your A-levels, universities ask it if you're choosing your course, and you might end up asking yourself the same question a lot of times if you do decide to study the law. It takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of time, and you may spend your life exploring it before you really get to the bottom of it. So it's something you've got to know that you want to do. I've made this video to try and explain the main reasons why it's easy to answer that question when you really know that law is the thing you want to study. I'm going to try and sum up all the best things about law so that you can answer this question for yourself. So, apart from the good things about law, which I'll get onto into a minute, quite a lot of the times where people say you shouldn't study law is because they think that it's boring. Now I'm going to explain to you why that isn't the case. And I'm going to use a little story to help me do that. The story happens in a remote part of the ocean. There's nothing around for miles. Nothing except one very small ship. The captain of the ship is a man called Mr. Dudley. There are two other men on the ship with Mr. Dudley. They're called Mr. Stevens and Mr. Brooks. There's also a cabin boy on the ship. His name is Richard Parker, and if you've ever watched A Life of Pi or read the book, you might just get the reference. Now, Richard Parker is 17 years old and he's an orphan. He hasn't been sailing for very long at all. One evening, the captain tells his men, "Slow the ship. Let's all rest comfortably for the night." All is well, and the weather is normal, it's perfectly calm. But then suddenly, without any warning and in clear weather, a huge wave crashes against the ship. She's severely damaged. Mr. Dudley, knowing about these things, says there's absolutely no hope of repair where they are. Within seconds, the crew are in a lifeboat, and within minutes, the ship has gone down. So here we join Mr. Dudley, Mr. Stevens, Mr. Brooks, and the cabin boy, Richard Parker, in an open lifeboat far, far away from land. They have only 2 cans of turnips for food. There's no water, and as experienced sailors, they know the seawater is not safe to drink. For 3 days, they eat turnips. On the 4th, they catch a small turtle, apparently, and they eat what they can of that. I can't imagine how much that is. By the 12th day, nothing is left of the turtle. For 8 days, there is nothing at all for the men to eat, and the only water that is safe to drink is the rainwater they can catch in their raincoats when they're not wearing them, which means taking them off, getting soaked through in the middle of the ocean just to try and gather some water. By the 18th day, the men are getting starved, they're getting parched, and they're getting frantic. Mr. Dudley and Mr. Stevens hatch a desperate plan. They wonder if there isn't another source of food to be found. Mr. Brooks won't agree to it. The men reach the 20th day on the lifeboat. Richard Parker is now gravely ill. He's the youngest of the group and he's extremely weak. having drunk seawater out of desperation. The men are all starving. Mr. Dudley and Mr. Stevens know that they won't last the next few days. Mr. Dudley says a prayer and walks to the boy lying in the bottom of the boat. Mr. Dudley pulls out a knife. He slits the boy's throat. The men eat Richard Parker. On the 24th day, a passing ship comes by. The men holler. The ship rescues the sailors and the remains of Richard Parker, the cabin boy. But after all these grisly events, the question we have to ask is, are the men guilty of murder? We know who killed Richard Parker. We know where and how they did it. We know exactly why they did it. The question that the court has to determine when they get back home is whether what they did is a crime. Should it be punished? And if so, how? If you are wondering, I will tell you later. So the first reason why you should study law is that it's just interesting for its own sake. Moral and philosophical questions like this come up all the time in the law, just like in Dudley and Stevens. And personally, I would not believe anybody who said that they didn't want to find out what happened in that case. So the first reason why you should study law, or why you should continue to study it if you start it, is because it's interesting in its own right. Now, reason number 2 why you should study the law is because it's useful. Knowledge of the law is extremely valuable, partly if you want to earn money, because lawyers tend to be very well paid. Barristers, solicitors, whichever area of law you choose to go into, or even if you're not from the UK, there's a reason why there is a stereotype of rich lawyers, and that's because it's a highly paid job, it's very skilled, people always need them. Secondly, it's useful for you too, not just for financial reasons. If you go into a shop, you're going to be entering into a contract. If you get married, you're entering into a contract. And, as we've seen, if you go sailing, you might not be entering a contract, but you are taking on a lot of potential legal implications by doing things like going out in a boat, taking people with you. Even if you do stuff that seems quite ordinary, like learning to drive, there are a lot of legal implications of those. You want to know exactly what they are, exactly how to do things right, so that you don't get into trouble with the law, and you might even benefit from it. So the second reason for learning the law, it's not just interesting, it's also useful. Thirdly, and as I've kind of alluded to, the law has implications for almost everything that we do. You take a trip to the shops, you go by car, you're already regulated by highway laws for as long as you're on the road. When you get to the shop has to be kept clean and tidy so that you don't trip over things. That is regulated by the Occupiers Liability Acts, which are actually quite complicated, but not so hard to understand if you're a lawyer. They are, in fact, the reason for the yellow wet floor signs that you always trip over, which I find particularly ironic. Now, having navigated safely to the checkout, you technically make an offer to the cashier, who might choose to accept it if they agree to sell the product to you. Now, you don't realise when you're purchasing your groceries that you're actually entering into a contract and that there are specific parts of this. But when you start to read the case law, such as the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain and Boots, the well-known pharmacy company, you'll find out that there are a lot of different elements to go into the checkouts that you never realised. It makes it quite interesting itself because you're interacting with the law without even noticing it. You'll meet it every day. Now, don't get me wrong, there are lots of interesting things about, say, maths, medicine, physics, but I think you'll need to use the law far more often. Like I've said, you see the law every day once you know where to spot it. You certainly use it every day, whether you like it or not. You'd be quite unlucky if you had to go to the doctor every day. And I've got to say, you'd be very unlucky if you had to use maths every day. So as well as being exciting and valuable, the law is also present in almost everything that we do. Now, my final reason for you to study the law is that it's really, really varied. There are all kinds of law. There's criminal law, like what regulates Dudley and Stephens. There's tax law that regulates how much of your money you get to keep and how much you give to the government. There's contract law that I've talked about. There's media law, there's medical law, there's family law, there's international law, there's human rights law, there's even sports law. So if you have an interest of any kind, chances are that it is regulated by law. And that means that you will find an interest in the law that matches with what you like to do outside of the law. And I think that's pretty cool. It's not even just the subject matter that changes in the law. Some law is made by Parliament in the UK, that's legislation, and it's focused on problem solving and how you phrase words to make them solve the specific problem you're trying to tackle. Then there's the common law, which is very important in England and Wales and Scotland, in fact, and Northern Ireland, which is called judge-made law, although that's not technically right. Judges only interpret the law, but that's a technicality. And the common law deals with cases where people have got things right, got things wrong, and then taken it to court to see who is right and what the result should be. So within each area of law, there are different legislation, there are different cases. All of this, I don't know if you could hear the car horn there, but that's a potential claim already in progress. As I was saying, all of this makes law really interesting, really varied, and just as I've done there, you'll see the law absolutely everywhere you turn. Not in a bad way, just in an interesting way. So we've seen 4 main reasons to study law. It's interesting, it's potentially valuable in a lot of different ways, it's relevant to your life every day, and it's varied. Now, one thing which I suspect you'd want to know is what happened to Dudley and Stephens after the case I discussed earlier. Well, I have my law books here. I've been taking a look to find out exactly what happened to the gentleman in that case, and I can tell you the court did find Dudley and Stephens guilty of murdering Richard Parker. They were in fact given the death sentence. It was actually reduced to what seems quite a drastic change, to only 6 months imprisonment, apparently, presumably out of sympathy for their situation. Quite an unusual case, but not unusual to find the law interesting at all. I hope you enjoyed hearing about it. And if you did, you're very welcome to leave a comment or like this, or who knows, subscribe. Make my day. Cheerio.